King of the Monsters is an arcade game that was released by SNK in 1991. In this game, you play as a giant monster and you fight other giant monsters in a little arena that happens to be located inside of a city. It sounds much better than it really is, especially if you were stuck with one of the home console ports. Takara handled the home console ports of this game. The Super Nintendo version was released in 1992, and the Sega Genesis port was released in 1993. This game was successful enough to warrant a sequel in 1992, and I'll talk about that at some other time. Right now, let's just focus on the Super Nintendo version. Since this is a port of an arcade game, I really wasn't expecting an amazing story. It just had to set up the whole, who the characters are and why are they fighting. And the story for King of the Monsters does exactly that. In the near future, super monsters emerge. The manual doesn't really give an explanation as to where they came from. It just says that they showed up, and, fair enough, that's really all you need for a game like this. And then they started fighting each other. Eventually there were only 4 left, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they started fighting in the land of civilization. Whatever the hell that is. It's strange. What happens when there's only one left? No one knows, and I guess it isn't all that important because the manual doesn't even speculate on it. This story gets the job done. It does make me wonder about what happened to all the other monsters that emerge, since you only see 4 in the console ports. There were more in the arcade versions, but only 2 more. So, yeah, it's a weird story, but it gets, the point across and kind of gives you an explanation for why everybody's fighting each other if you really needed one. There really isn't too much to say about the gameplay here. You pick a monster and then you fight in an arena. If you win, then you move on to the next arena and fight a different monster. The console ports only have 4 of the 6 monsters, which is pretty sad. I mean, the arcade game only had 6, so I'm not really sure what the problem was, but whatever. So, the roster in the console ports is Gion, who I'm probably pronouncing that right, who is a Godzilla-inspired monster, Rocky, who's a big golem, Beetlemania, who's a giant rhinoceros beetle, Astro Guy, who is a giant human that was inspired by Ultraman. The 2 characters from the arcade game that are missing from this are a King Kong monster called Wu and a toxic sludge monster. I'm a little surprised that they didn't include, the giant gorilla in this. It would have been really cool to kind of recreate, King Kong versus Godzilla on either of the home console versions of the game. But I guess they, just had to cut him out for whatever reason. One cool thing about the game is that, each arena is a city. It's explained in the manual what was going on, but I'm just not sure why there's an electric fence that's keeping you from, really roaming around. It would have been fine if they just had an invisible barrier to stop you, but no, they threw an invisible fence in there. It's kind of a weird touch, and I couldn't figure out why it existed. I had to check the manual just to see what all the moves were. The game gives you some of the basics when you start up, and there are prompts to help you while you're fighting, especially if you're getting pinned or if you get knocked down and need to stand back up. The game will kind of prompt you to mash one of the buttons. It's nice, but, I don't know. I feel like there should have been something else with this. Playing it on the Super Nintendo was pretty easy. I didn't really go into the Sega Genesis version because I figured it was basically the same game. It's kind of weird. There is like a grapple system in this, and also you win by pinning your opponent and, keeping them down to a count of 3, which makes me feel like this is almost a wrestling game. It's very, very close to being a wrestling game. Honestly, a lot of the controls, the way they work, it feels like you're playing WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, or WWF in your house. That's really the best way I can describe the gameplay here. It's weird that when you get your opponent down to, no life, they don't just get knocked out, but whatever. I guess the game just didn't want to do it that way. The manual does explain all of this stuff, and it is available online, so that's really great. You can pick up several things and throw them at your opponent, which is kind of cool. So you can pick up tanks, ships, helicopters, and jets. It makes a lot of sense for a game like this. The environments are all fairly destructible, so just walking around, you're blowing up different houses and buildings and that sort of thing. There's also a few power-ups that you can get in this, which is kind of fun. I like the fact that that's in there. There's not really anything else to say. Overall, the gameplay is fine. It's a fun arcade game that has a serious lack of content in the home console ports. King of the Monsters would have been just a weekend rental back in the day, or one of those games that sat on your shelf for a while after you've beaten it a few times and then just completely forgot about it. King of the Monsters is a great looking game. I love the pixel art on the character sprites. The levels look very good. There are only 4 levels and 4 characters though, so there's not a lot here, but what is here looks excellent. The level design isn't anything special. It's just a patch of a city that's ringed by an electric fence. It's easy to see the fence though, so that's great, and I like how the game shows the impact of the monsters fighting in the city. Because there are only 4 characters, the developers, swapped the color palettes for these guys a lot. They had to. It's just one of the rough things with a game like this. It is a cheap way to tell which character you're playing as when you end up fighting the same character, or if you're going up against your friend and you both happen to pick Astro Guy or something like that. There really isn't too much else to say about the graphics. What is in the game looks very good, but there's just not much of it, which is something I could say about the gameplay as well. King of the Monsters has a lot of reviews for it. Because it was released in the arcades and on the home consoles over the years, like multiple consoles over the years, it took a while to really get a consensus on just the 1990 reviews. This is great because there are so many reviews for it on just all the different versions. So yeah, you can kind of pick and choose what you want. I really tried to stick to the Super Nintendo reviews from the early 90s, but that was kind of rough at times. I went to Moby Games because they generally aggregate all of these for me, so that's kind of nice. And I was just trying to get a consensus for all of these. What this tells me is that, the game is pretty average, and yeah, that's kind of what I experienced. I know that there's a lot of nostalgia for, games like this, and so when you go back and you look at something like this in retrospect, it's probably going to change how you think. You might be more forgiving for some of the flaws in the game. What I'm looking at when I see this is it's just an average game that has probably been forgotten, even by SNK, since they really haven't done too much with the characters and they haven't released another game since really 1992. So looking at what Moby Games said, the aggregate for both players and critics is 60%. That's not too far off from where I was. But I wouldn't let these scores actually, impact your opinion of it. If you enjoyed this when you were a kid, then that's great. Don't let anybody else's opinion on this really impact what you get out of it. When I was playing this, I had the same feeling that I had when I was playing the Super Nintendo version of Mr. Do, and honestly many of the other arcade ports that were on the Super Nintendo. There's just not really enough here to warrant buying this game. It would have been a fun game to rent back in the day, and it would be fun to hang out with a couple of your friends and play this for however long they can all stand it. But I just don't see a reason to go out and, get the original cartridge. This is, a game that is probably best experienced on an emulator, so you don't have to go out and try to find a working copy of it. And honestly, I would go out and try to get the arcade ROM, because that one has a little bit more, or at least a few more characters that you can play around with. Both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis version are just lacking in a lot of areas, and nothing was really done to add more replay value to this, because once you're done beating the game on one character, you're essentially going to be doing the same thing for the other three. It really doesn't help that this thing has a very small roster, with only 4 characters and just not a lot of replayability, and honestly, it's pretty repetitive. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.